Hello, my name's Jonathan White. I'm Professor of Politics at the European Institute of the London School of Economics, and I'm very pleased today to be leading a discussion on a fascinating new book that's come out just a few weeks ago called Europe as Ideological Resource, European Integration and Far-Right Legitimation in France and Italy. I'm joined by the author of the book, who is Marta Lorimer here, Fellow in European Politics at the London School of Economics. Also discussing is Sofia Vasilopoulou from King's College London, Professor of European Politics, and Stijn van Kessel, Reader in European Politics at Queen Mary University of London. We are discussing a book that moves from the history of European integration and its significance for the far right through to a contemporary situation where the far right seems to be quite central to everyone's expectations of where the electoral results of the European Parliament elections in the next few weeks are going to emerge, and indeed going on into the next 5 years, the cycle of the European Parliament, where I think a lot of people are expecting the far right to be quite central to how European politics plays out in this period. So this is a book that offers a kind of hinge, if you like, between everything that we may think we know about the history of the far right in European integration and thinking about where we're going from here onwards. So if you have interests in the far right, contemporary European politics, the history of European integration, or the concept of ideology more generally, I think you'll find this book of great interest. Do join us for the forthcoming discussion. So we're here to discuss a book that has come out very recently called Europe as Ideological Resource, European Integration and Far-Right Legitimation in France and Italy. So Europe as Ideological Resource, I guess the subtitle makes it fairly clear that this is a resource for the far right. And I think one of the interesting features of this book is to emphasize that a political orientation that we might often think as wanting to have little to do with Europe, taking distance from Europe, that historically there's actually been quite a long-standing connection between how the far right thinks about itself and presents itself and matters European. So Europe as an ideological resource for the far right, a kind of a useful foil over the years. But I was wondering, Marta, if you could start us off by saying something a little more about in what sense an ideological resource. I'm assuming this is something to do with electoral politics and success in electoral politics, broader issues of legitimacy. But if this is a resource for the far right, in what sense has it been a resource?
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Jonathan, and for this question. So in the book, I talk about Europe as an ideological resource, and as you correctly note, the subtitle tells you almost everything you need to know about your question, because the subtitle is European Integration and Far-Right Legitimation. So the idea that I advance in the book is that far-right parties have historically suffered from a legitimacy deficit. So that might not be the case today, but if we look at it historically, far-right parties were very much treated as pariah parties. And they have had to find different ways to address this legitimacy deficit. And in the book, I suggest that the positions that they developed on European integration help them address it and help them build a more legitimate image. I particularly focus on 4 key discourses that they associate with Europe. I look at how they speak of Europe as a form of identity, which helps them transnationalize their message. I also look at how they speak of Europe through the prism of liberty, which helps them align with more mainstream discourses about things that we might consider desirable. I also show that they present Europe as endangered by a series of threats, which helps them appeal to a logic of desperate times call for desperate measures. And finally, I also show how all of these concepts that they use to make sense of Europe are also fairly consistent with their ideological core of nationalism, which really helps them keep their core supporters close. So the idea is that really Europe functions as an ideological resource because it helps them attract a new public, but also maintaining the core electorate that they already had.
And just to remind us, the chronological spread that you're interested in here is taking us back to the beginning of European integration. What is the timescale here?
Yeah, roughly halfway through. So I look at this specifically in France and Italy between 1978 and 2019. And I started in 1978 because this is 1979 is when we have the first European Parliament elections. So the first European open EU Parliament elections.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so there's the headline news about the book, but we're going to go a bit in more detail about the findings, about the motivation for particular aspects of it. Sophia, do you want to start us off with maybe a little bit picking up on what Marta's been saying about the place of Europe as a place in an ideology, as something that contributes to the far right as an ideology?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, this has been a fascinating book and I've learned a lot. I found particularly interesting how you talk about the two parties, the parties in France and in Italy, of making Europe as an object of ideological contestation. I wonder if you could further unpack this idea for us. How does Europe become part of a party's ideology?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and it's about it's a big part of what the book is about. It's really asking this question of how is it that political parties make sense of Europe? And in this specific case of the far right, what I argue in the book is that they rely on familiar concepts in the worldview to essentially read Europe and integrate it in their ideological framework. And that's very much where these core discourses that then I discuss later on come from. So I suggest that, first of all, they make sense of Europe in terms of identity. We know this to be a core part of the nationalist ideology of the far right. They also use this concept of liberty, which might seem counterintuitive, but makes sense once you start thinking about nationalism, not just about identifying a specific group, but also about its political expression. The concept of a threat is a bit more, it's a less central concept, but it's certainly one that is fairly distinctive to the far right and that really helps set them apart from other political parties. And the final concept that I talk about that kind of brings all of this together is an idea of the national interest. So again, this would seem something quite central to the far right. So really, the book traces how these familiar concepts from the realm of nationalism are used to integrate a new issue such as Europe.
Stijn, you've written a lot about the far right, its relationship to mainstream politics. How does the argument that Marta's just given us sound to you, and what stands out for you?
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading this book. I think it's not only very well written, but also very rich in terms of both the empirical material and the theoretical claim. I thought it showed very well how Europe is an ideological resource for these parties. And also it showed that these parties may not be as naturally Eurosceptic as is often assumed by taking a longer term perspective. I did wonder, can Europe also be sometimes a difficult issue for them to navigate? So not only a resource, but also a tricky issue, especially if they want to collaborate with mainstream parties who do not want to hold European integration to the extent that they do. So it might be hard, especially when they're in office, to fulfill their promises to really alter the course of European integration or to reform the EU. So how do you look at this? Could it also be a tricky issue for them rather than a resource?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is an issue that has the potential to be tricky. And we've seen this particularly with mainstream parties that have had a really difficult time navigating European integration and working out how to place themselves. This is why we frequently talk about it as a wedge issue. What I think, the reason I think that for far-right parties it has worked a little bit more as a resource than as a hindrance is because they have been much less divided in terms of how to approach it. And a lot of these parties, and particularly the two case studies that I work on, tend to be more leader-centric, which also means that it's easier to quash any attempt to bring forward a position on Europe that is slightly more to the side of what the party would want to be claiming. But I think this is also something that Sofia has actually worked on a lot, which is how far-right parties have historically been able to moderate their Euroscepticism precisely to achieve a certain kind of governmental position and place themselves more strategically with respect to other political actors.
Yes, actually picking up on that, one dimension of the book I particularly enjoyed is how you approach the complexity of the relationship between the far right on the one hand and the issue of Europe on the other. I wonder if you could help us unpack a little bit this complexity. Why is it complex? In what ways is it complex? And why is it important to recognize such complexity in their views?
Yeah, so one of the core claims that I advance in the book is that we tend to see the far right as this homogenous Eurosceptic group, and that this is actually not a very good way of approaching it. Part of the argument that I advance is historical. The far right hasn't always been anti-EU. That might be the case today, but it wasn't always the case. If you look specifically at the Italian social movement or even at the National Rally in the 1980s, these parties were actually fairly favorable to European integration. Things start changing around the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, but this doesn't happen everywhere. So again, the National Rally actually takes a heavily Eurosceptic stance, whereas the Italian social movement and then the Alleanza Nazionale stay much more positive in their overall assessment of European integration. So seeing these as a Eurosceptic, this very, very homogenous Eurosceptic bloc, doesn't really reflect the history of the far right. The other way in which this vision of the far right as generally Eurosceptic isn't quite reflective, I suppose, of their positions on Europe more broadly, is that they might be EU skeptic to the extent that they don't like the European Union, but this doesn't really tell us much about how they feel about Europe. And this is important because these parties will tend to distinguish between Europe, intended as this broad civilizational construct, and the European Union as a concrete political project. So we'll see them, for example, make claims such as, oh no, but we love the European Union, we love Europe, but that's why we hate the European Union. Le Pen does it, but she's not the only one using this kind of language. In other European parties. The final element that I add, which is a bit more of an aside, is that if we look at the far right as Eurosceptic, we might be willing to try and jump the gun and just assume that, well, they hate the European Union. So if they do get anywhere close to it, they're going to try and destroy it. And I think this really underplays the extent to which these parties really benefit from European integration and how they've historically been able to benefit from it. And that's why I try to suggest that it's perhaps best to think of them as Euro-ambivalent rather than Eurosceptic, because I think it gives us, well, first of all, a more accurate picture of what we're dealing with, but also a more nuanced assessment in terms of what they're actually going to be like in their interactions with the European Union.
I guess this is also a reminder of some of the limits of the concept of Euroscepticism, that it exactly conflates these rather different orientations, one towards something more general called Europe and one towards a particular object such as the European Union. I would assume that part of what you're reminding us here is that we should be wary of a concept that is perhaps too quick to blend what needs sometimes at least to be kept separately.
Yeah, exactly. I think that this is something that is really worth keeping in mind, that we tend to conflate the European Union with Europe. And this has become even more prominent since the EU has expanded to pretty much cover most of Europe, most of the European continent. But this is still a distinction that exists and that political parties might actually want to play with, and not just the far right. Boris Johnson used very, very similar language to say that he didn't like the European Union, but that he also didn't think that Europe and the European Union were the same thing. So it is a useful distinction to actually have in mind.
Yeah, I also agree that it's important to keep in mind the ambivalence of a lot of these actors, and also that there are a lot of shades of gray. Still, you could say I think the French case, the Rassemblement National or the Front National before, is kind of exemplary in a case shifting from seeing Europe, as you also describe in your book, as Europe a continent being threatened, emphasizing very much a common European identity, towards more skepticism to the EU as an institution. Might there be a scenario where we see a pull in the other direction again, where radical right parties, far right parties may actually recognize that the EU may be actually a force for good for them, that they can use it and that they can also shape it to their own wishes? Might they become more pro-EU at a certain point in time, would you say?
Yeah, I've been wondering about this, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine, and if that might prompt some of these parties to actually shift their views on the European Union. To some extent, we have seen some far-right parties actually frame their positions on Ukraine in a more European context, but I don't think we've actually seen anything similar to what we saw in the 1980s, where particularly European integration was seen as a way to stand up to the USSR. And to a lesser extent to the US. I don't really think that we're going to see the same kind of shift again. So a shift again from opposition to European integration to more support for it. But of course, if perhaps if the war in Ukraine seeped into European borders, we might actually see something of a change. But I think it would take something quite radical to actually see the radical right shift again position to where they were, say, in the 1980s.
That might well have to do with sort of the course of European integration. After Maastricht, there was too much sovereignty pulled for radical right parties to still be able to support this, right? Because their main emphasis is still on national sovereignty and protecting the nation from supranational elitist organizations. So might it be related to that also, basically the course of European integration and the shape it currently takes?
Yes, exactly. That's something that I discuss in the book, is really that one of the reasons why particularly the National Rally really shifts radically is the Single European Act first, and then the Maastricht Treaty. Which is essentially a qualitative shift in the way in which European integration functions. This is slightly different for the MSI National Alliance, but it is interesting, even in their case, that when they were criticizing the Maastricht Treaty, their beef with it is that it wasn't political enough. And what they meant by that was that it really didn't go far enough in terms of creating a European Union that would project power beyond its borders, so that had a foreign policy component to it. They were criticizing it because it was too much of a market.
Yes, that's very interesting, and actually echoes quite a lot of my research on kind of the various differences across these parties, especially when it comes to their view of the European Union. But I want to take us back a little bit to the concept of Europe. As a broader concept, that one of its dimensions is, of course, European integration. How do these parties view Europe? You've already alluded to some differences. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And has this changed over time? Obviously, we've seen how views of the European Union have changed, but Europe as a continent, do they see it differently now compared to, say, 20 years ago?
Yeah, so I think I found a lot of continuity in terms of their way of speaking about Europe and thinking about Europe. There's, of course, some historical context here where, for example, in the 1980s, a lot of their thinking about Europe was about getting back Central and Eastern Europe and really presenting Europe, the European continent, as divided in a way that was unnatural. I think particularly around the end of the 1980s in the National Rally, they really start thinking more consistently about what exactly it is that they mean by Europe. And this is where we start seeing this language of Europe as a specific civilization with its own traditions. And the National Rally really actually discusses in a little bit of depth. They're still very vague in terms of how they talk about it, but this idea of Europe as a civilization. what's also interesting is what they take to be the greatest achievement of this European civilization, which shifts a little bit through time, and particularly from the early 90s, what they put forward as Europe's greatest achievement is the nation state. So European civilization is wonderful, it's beautiful, but what really makes it unique is the fact that it gave birth to the nation state. And this really feeds into then the criticism of the European Union. The other thing that they become much more specific about, particularly, is the borders of this European community, and specifically the idea that Turkey does not belong to it. So this is less framed in religious terms, but they do think of Europe as culturally Christian. This is slightly different from the National Alliance, which doesn't actually necessarily oppose Turkish accession to the European Union. But their way of thinking about this European civilization that is somehow beyond the European Union is actually quite in line with the way in which the EU talks about this. So particularly at the time of the debates on the European Constitution, they speak about Europe as this continent and civilization that is Judeo-Christian, and that has been marked by the experience of sharing Roman law. So there is some change over time, but some of the change also depends on what is it that they're really trying to forefront. What is it that they're talking about? So if you're going to be talking about Turkey, then you might as well want to say that what really makes European civilization distinctive, it's Christianity.
That's interesting, and actually which leads me to another thought I had when I was reading your book, which is your concept about pro-European nativism. So at the first reading, this concept appears very contradictory because Europeanism is all about coming together and inclusion. Nationalism often is about exclusion. How do you think these two ideas do actually come together in their rhetoric?
Yeah, so I think that one way in which this idea of Euro-nativism makes sense is that you're certainly right that one way to think about Europeanism is as nations coming together. But by coming together, you're also creating a division between Europe and the rest of the world. So this is very much what comes into this idea, for example, of fortress Europe. And that is something that the far right can actually get on board with, that you are talking about a form of European nativism, where there's this great European civilization, and it is a clearly us versus them oriented discourse in which you're essentially recreating that division at the national level between the national us and the them that is outside, but you're upgrading it a little bit, and particularly in a way that isn't too intrusive. Because I think when they speak about the relationship between, for example, a European and a national identity, it is fairly clear that the national identity is really the central one, but the European one is almost this concentric circle view. It's still something that can coexist with a national identity. It's just going to be secondary.
Can I ask another question about concepts? Because the book is structured around these four concepts that you found to be very important in the discourse around Europe of these parties. One concept that I think you mentioned in the book that you also found it, but it was slightly less central. I was a bit surprised that you didn't find democracy to be also one of these core concepts. The category of parties you're studying is the far right, which is something different from the populist radical right. However, many of these parties are also populist, and they focus very much on the idea that the elites are betraying the ordinary people, and that the principle of popular sovereignty is sort of suppressed by the process of European integration. And a lot of these parties argue that power should be given back to the ordinary people. So can you reflect a little bit on this? Didn't you find this back as a core theme also in the discourse around European integration of these parties?
Yeah, so I found the theme of democracy to be more prominent in the national rally. And I put it under this bigger heading of liberty because to me, it seems that questions about democracy are ultimately also questions about self-rule and how do you perform this form of self-rule. So particularly in the book, I also discuss what they have to say about the European Union and how it impinges on democracy specifically. I think one of the reasons why it's not more central theme is because of the comparative nature of the project. So here I was looking at two far-right parties, the Italian Social Movement, National Alliance, and the National Rally. And what is distinctive about the Italian Social Movement specifically is that this is not a party of the radical right. So it's not a party that accepts the institutions of democracy, but it is commonly defined as a party of the extreme right. So a party that rejects democratic institutions. I think particularly towards the end of their political history, they're becoming more and more acquainted with democratic institutions. They're becoming more and more accepting of them. But democracy is not a key theme for the MSI. They will talk about self-rule and they'll talk about autonomy, but not for the people. They're not populist in the sense that they care about the people. But they'll think about it as something that the nation must have. And that is something that is separate from the people for them. So I think in that sense, it's also it's a more recent topic and one that doesn't necessarily matter across the board.
So we're recording this discussion in the spring of 2024. And in just a few weeks, we have a European parliamentary election where many people feel that the far right is going to do quite well. And of course, this is to some degree testament to many of the tendencies you've been describing over the course of the book, this capacity to draw strength from a theme that might initially seem to be a stumbling block. I wanted to ask you, Marta, as we go into this election period, is Europe an ideological resource in this coming election? Is this going to be the basis, do you think, on which the far right seeks to achieve the electoral result that many people expect?
So I think what's tricky about using Europe as an ideological resource today is that it has lost some of its shine. So one of the points that I make in the book is that what really made Europe an ideological resource at the beginning is that it was a new issue on which parties didn't necessarily have an established position. And this really gave the far right a lot of leeway in terms of how they would phrase it. So I think in that sense, Europe might be a less strong ideological resource because, well, it is no longer a new issue. And on top of that, at this point, the far right has a fairly well-established profile on it. On top of that, in the specific context of the European elections, one of the problems with them is that, as we know, they rarely tend to be about Europe. But I do think that we've still seen these parties rely on the discourses that I actually describe in the book. So, for example, if we look at Giorgia Meloni and how she has approached the European Union, it has been quite clear that she's been using a lot of the language of this pro-Europeanism that comes from her party, to the extent that actually in her book, she uses the MSI's history of being pro-European as a way to rebuke those who criticize her as a Eurosceptic leader. Again, Marine Le Pen's discourse is still, well, she's not leading the electoral campaign. It's in fact Jordan Bardella, who's the current leader of the National Rally. But we still see them center a lot on these themes of liberty, of self-rule, of rejecting European control. There's also a very real threat, in fact, in the European elections that we can think about, and this is Russia. So in this sense, we're still seeing a lot of these discourses still present in the way in which they're approaching the electoral campaign. So European integration and Europe might function a little bit less as an ideological resource, but it is still something that is there in the way in which these parties talk about Europe.
This is also something I wondered about. I've been wondering about for a long time, in fact. To what extent does it really matter, their positions on Europe? Do their voters really care about it? So can you also say that on the demand side, their discourse about Europe has been enabling to attract new voters? Or is Europe more of a trash can kind of concept that allows them to emphasize the issues they really, and their voters really care about, not least immigration and the opening of borders?
I love the idea of a trash can concept. But no, this is the bane of the existence of any scholar of Euroscepticism or of Europe, which is really how much do people care about Europe? And I think I very much agree with the second suggestion that you're making, that Europe is not a particularly central part of why voters vote for the far right. It is one of them, but it's not exactly their unique selling point. But it is a way in which it's an area in which they can repeat things that matter to their voters in other contexts. So if their voters really care about immigration, they can build that link with the European Union, with European integration, or with Europe as being the civilizational construct that you might want to use to keep out those who are not European. So it does offer this additional arena, in a way, that they can exploit to really get their message across and keep their voters on board with them.
Yes, that's very interesting. And I think it also somewhat relates to how their voter makeup is changing over time, because as they become closer to power, obviously they have more voters as well. A lot of theory suggests that when these parties approach power, if they govern, as in the case of Italy, or if they are in opposition, as it's the case in France, generally their Euroscepticism wanes. Have you actually observed that now? I mean, of course, Meloni's Euroscepticism was never as hard, but in the case of France, they are coming from a background of even asking for French exit from the European Union. How do you think this is playing out currently in the upcoming of these elections?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because Europe, at least as far as the French election is concerned, has so far been not really a concern for anyone. On the date when the National Rally launched their campaign, Jordan Bardella talked about immigration. He didn't really say much about Europe. We'll see if this changes, because Macron is expected to actually give a speech on Europe, which might change a little bit. But what's been striking about Le Pen is precisely since the 2017 election, where some suggested that her idea about leaving the European Union might have scared off a lot of voters, she has been remarkably quiet on the issue of European integration. So she hasn't really tried to moderate what she has to say about it. It's rather that she's essentially just leaving it quiet until she absolutely has to talk about it. For Meloni's really interesting, because Brothers of Italy at the beginning was actually quite Eurosceptic. They then moderated through time, and particularly since Meloni got into government, everyone seems to be extremely surprised at just how friendly she is with the EU establishment. And my suspicion is that, first of all, Meloni needs EU funding. So the recovery plan funding is something that she absolutely needs. So she needs to build good relations to have some kind of leeway in terms of how she manages this. But she's also using Europe as a way to address concerns about her party's neo-fascist past, because of course Brothers of Italy is the successor party of the Italian social movement and National Alliance. So again, Europe does seem to work as an ideological resource for her in the way in which she's using it. And finally, I suppose sometimes there are parallels drawn with Orban, and one thing that we might want to remember is that Orban didn't start picking fights from the EU from the get-go. First, he consolidated power at home, and then he started picking up fights with the EU. So I think we'll have to see how Meloni's positions evolve over time before we can make a sound judgment call in terms of what her European agenda really is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, of course, and their agendas are fluctuating and changing over time, and I think that is a theme that comes across in the book quite strongly. I would like to just briefly zoom out from the EU and just think about these parties' general or international agenda more generally. I just wonder how their EU positions might relate to their positions towards the United States or Russia more recently. I see quite a lot of variation in that theme. Is this something you have reflected upon?
Yeah, so I frequently get questions about how Russia plays into the book's argument, because of course for a good part of the book story we're not talking about Russia, we're talking about the USSR as the proper enemy. What has been interesting to observe, of course, is that the USSR was the enemy for a lot of far-right parties, but then Russia became an inspiration. And today we kind of see both coexist within the radical right. So within the far right, with one part of it that still looks at Russia as an inspiration, who are willing to be more compromising in their positions towards Putin. Whereas there's another part of the far right, which in fact has kind of gone back to that historical skepticism towards the USSR and towards Russia. And the Italian far right is interesting because, of course, the two parties in there have taken different positions on the issue. Salvini still remains fairly attached to Russia, whereas Meloni has gone in the complete opposite direction and asserted herself on this Atlanticist position, which interestingly is fairly consistent with where the MSI stood in its history, and the National Alliance even more so, in that they were fiercely Atlanticist in their positions.
That's very, actually, this specific point is very interesting, because if you see historically, this is something that really takes the National Alliance and MSI as a party quite different from the trend. Why was that the case? Why were they so pro-Atlanticist? Does it relate to the history of the party, or does it relate to the history of the country, or a combination of the two?
So it's a combination of the two. A lot of it had to do with the, well, first of all, with the fact that Italy had a very large communist party, and that the MSI was strongly anti-communist. And they saw this as an intelligent way to place themselves in some kind of majority. This was a neo-fascist party in Italy in the 1940s and 1950s. They were very, very lonely. So by placing themselves against the USSR and in a pro-NATO position, they saw this as a way to kind of normalize their position. But it was a heavily debated topic in the MSI, particularly in the 1940s and 1950s. And then in the middle of the 1950s, they decided that they were going to take an Atlanticist stance and more or less stick with it, although there were certain movements in the party that were much more skeptical about it.
Could I ask one more issue? You kind of touched on it already, like the normalization of the far right, and them not necessarily needing the topic of Europe anymore so much to get a more legitimate image, because they're basically already legitimate actors and mainstream, and also their mainstream competitors are contributing towards their normalization by shifting closer to radical right terrain. Might there still be, the thing I wanted to ask about, in more and more countries we do, however, see competition between far-right parties. Italy is an example, also my native Netherlands, where you have Wilders' Freedom Party, who is now the more established far-right actor, and Thierry Baudet's Forum for Democracy, who still takes a very hard Eurosceptic position. Now, Wilders, who is certainly still not a friend of Europe, he has kind of moderated on this position. Before he wants an exit, to leave the European Union. Now he's sort of backtracking from this. Is Europe still a relevant theme, you might say, in the competition between far-right actors within certain countries?
Yeah, I think it can still really function that way, particularly within countries. I think that Italy is, again, a good case study, because the League is still much more Eurosceptic than Brothers of Italy. And this seems to be something that they're trying to play with. Not the best time in their life for the League, unfortunately, but it can still be something that far-right parties can use to sort of differentiate between themselves, and also with mainstream competitors, because they are still likely to have more radical position than mainstream actors that are particularly involved in EU decision-making.
I think the central theme of our discussion has, of course, been this rather tight, surprisingly tight relationship between Europe and the not just electoral success, but also broader legitimization of the far right. At the same time, I think there's a sub-theme that's come through, which is, if you like, the diminishing returns, potentially, of Europe as something that can offer this, whether it's because the European Union has changed, whether it's because the far right has changed, or whether because what once was an issue with a certain novelty no longer perhaps has that complexion. And so, as we zoom out a little bit from the place of Europe in the ideology of the far right, firstly, would you go with that idea that potentially we are at the high watermark of this relationship, and that potentially the far right will need other concepts, other themes that will have to play a similar function to what Europe has done up to now and perhaps can continue to do less so? And if so, what might they be? I mean, clearly climate change at one level might seem to be the kind of topic that has that novelty, has that respectability amongst a certain constituency that would allow those that are trying to make themselves respectable, give them a resource with which to position themselves. At the same time, clearly this may be the kind of issue where the far right can only go so far in embracing it, and perhaps also wants to define itself, well, at the extreme by some kind of eco-fascist position, but perhaps more moderately as something sceptical about responses to climate change, if not about the very existence of global warming. So I guess two questions. Firstly, should we be expecting the emergence of other themes that play an analogous role to the way that you have described Europe? And if so, what might they be?
Yeah, I think that we can expect other issues, and particularly the issue of climate change is one that I discuss in the conclusion of the book. So, I mean, first of all, the far right needs less and less legitimizing, because at this point they have very much become, if not mainstream actors, part of what we consider the normal realm of politics. And this has not only been their own doing. Mainstream parties also played a role in normalizing the message of the far right. But if they did still feel the need for additional normalization, because in some countries they're still looked at as somehow beyond the norm, I think climate change has a lot of the same characteristics that Europe had at the beginning. It is a new-ish issue. I mean, we've known about climate change being an issue for several decades now, but it is acquiring much more salience right now, so parties have to take a stance on it. But it's also an extremely divisive one, both for parties, because it's not particularly clear how you would position yourself on climate change as a political party. So it does mean that you have a little bit of leeway. And it's divisive for electorates as well, particularly because it might seem that there's an intuitive way of dealing with it, but that this is also going to have very serious repercussions. So in that sense, I think that it is an issue that can become a new form of ideological resource for the far right, and where they can play with different positions. Because, for example, they can frame it in identitarian terms by suggesting that the protection of the environment is an essential part of what it means to be a nation. This goes back to a discourse about roots, which is really important to nationalism. They can also frame it in terms of freedom, though, and this idea of liberty by saying, look, we just don't want the European Union, for example, to be legislating on our climate policies. We want to do it in a way that is best for us. It's a very real threat. So the language of the threat would really resonate with what we are hearing about a climate emergency. And again, it links quite nicely with this idea of a national interest that needs to be pursued, either through the protection of the environment or through the rejection of exceedingly demanding environmental legislation. So in this sense, I think that it is an issue that really carries a lot of potential for far-right parties. And we are, in fact, seeing these parties engage more and more with the so-called green agenda.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've had a pretty comprehensive and fascinating discussion here, looking backwards into the history of the far right and its increasing normalization, and finishing up with some thoughts about what may assist it in future, and actually whether it needs all that much assistance, or whether the far right has become such a essential protagonist of contemporary European politics that the need for these kind of resources is perhaps not as pronounced as it would have been once for the far right. So I'd like to thank everyone who's been discussing Marta's book, so Sofia Vasilopoulou, Stijn van Kessel. I'd also like to thank Marta for writing this fascinating book, Europe as Ideological Resource, which is already available online, possibly in bookshops as well, and I would recommend those of you who are interested in the topic of either Europe or indeed the far right to read this with some urgency. It's a great book and it's available now. Thank you to everyone for coming along to discuss it.